people into procurement. First item on the agenda is apologies for absence.
We have apologies from Hazel Morris.
Okay, and I have I've had an email from Councillor, not an email, a phone call from Councillor Wendy Fitzgerald. She will join us when she possibly can log on. Next item is the disclosure of personal and prejudicial interest. Members first. Anyone? Mike?
Yes, Chair. Agenda item number 6, the annual report of schools audits 2020-21. Pentre Harvard School being a governor on that board. Personal interest.
Yeah, and I think I've got the same as well, but I would suspect that because the audit process is for all of the schools, then I think we need to have just a general declaration of interest across all members, because all members are members of governing bodies as well. And I think to cover ourselves, if we say we have a general interest, all members have an interest in the auditing of school funds. I think that's
I'll pop that in the minutes.
Pardon?
Yeah, I'll pop that in the minutes.
Yeah, is that all right for members? Because I think you need to we cover ourselves then. Okay, the next item on the has officers got any issues? Any declarations? No. Okay, then we move on to the prohibition of whipped votes and declarations of party whips. And then item 4 is the minutes of the previous meeting. Are there any issues on that? Those minutes? No? If there's no issues, everybody happy? On item 5, which is the next item on the agenda, is the public questions, and I'm not aware of any. Michelle, have we got any?
No, we've had no public questions today.
Okay, right. Then we move on to the item 6, which is the audit of procurement, auditing of procurement. And can I welcome Simon here, who is our auditor for the council, and Chris, who I think Simon or David, do you want to say anything prior to the auditor, or?
No, all I wanted to do was just to say, you know, welcome at this opportunity to address scrutiny this morning, and just to reassure anything we can do to assist this inquiry panel, we're there to do so. I don't want to talk too long. I think we've got a bit of work to do and put a considerable amount on the agenda. So I'm here just in a supportive role with the officers present. So happy to take any questions as we go along.
Okay, then can I ask then, Simon, do you want to take us through the report?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chair, and welcome all. Good morning. Some of you recognise me from the audit committee meetings, I assume, and I recognise a few faces on the panel. But I've been asked to attend today just to give an overview, really, of the work that we undertake in audit generally, not specifically for schools. That's just one example that we've added to the report to give some demonstration into the testing that we undertake. So as members are aware, the panel asked a number of specific questions of myself previously. So this report sort of summarises those responses really from myself and gives a flavour of the procurement work that we do in internal audit. So if we go on to the section 2 generally, I'll skim through the key points of the report, if that's okay, Chair, and then wait for any questions at the end, if that's okay with members. Yep. So the questions I was asked specifically, question 1 in 2.2, the overall role of internal audit as a primary function is to check that the correct processes and procedures are being followed across the organisation. So in terms of checking against procurement activity, we would check against accounting instructions, contract procedure rules, check any spending restrictions to see if any spend's been against those spending restrictions, and any other procurement guidance that's been issued by Procurement and Chris Williams. Just to give members an idea of the audit programme itself, most of our audits are on a rolling basis. So we have a set of audits across the whole organisation that are done between either 2 or 5 years, depending on the risk score for each audit. So they are done on a periodic rolling basis. So ordinarily, we would do an audit every 3 years generically across the organisation, different establishments, different departments, key systems like fundamental audits, etc., etc. 2.5 summarises the standard expenditure testing that we look at as part of our review. And that looks at extracting data from the general ledger. So we take direct reports from the spend records on Oracle, and then we check against those transactions for adherence to contract procedure rules. So, for example, we look at has an order been created on the general ledger? Are there adequate segregation of duties in terms of placing the order, receipting the goods, and making payment? Check that they've complied with contract procedure rules. So any purchases over 10k have had the required number of quotations, they've gone out to tender, and that sort of thing. Schools are generally audited separately because they're obviously not on our central ledger system, but we have access directly to the school's accounting ledger, essentially, the school's financial systems. So when we undertake school audits, we have direct access to that transaction data as well, and we audit those directly, either individually as part of an individual school audit, or this year in particular, because of access issues in terms of access to schools, we've actually undertaken thematic reviews of procurement in both comprehensive schools and primary schools, which is why I've included the report as an appendices for more information on that. We also undertake some contract audits, which is shown in Appendix 1, which gives members some more detail in terms of more specific contract or procurement reviews that we undertake outside of the standard establishment or departmental or fundamental reviews. So overall, this is part of the bread and butter of our work, essentially. We look at income and expenditure as key areas, really, in terms of nearly every audit that we undertake, obviously to ensure value for money and to ensure that, the correct procedures are being followed as per the contract procedure rules. If we go on to question 4, in terms of cost effectiveness in 2.14, obviously we do check that the contract procedures have been followed, but it's often important to consider not just value, not just cost in terms of lowest value. Are there other criteria that need to be met in terms of evaluating value for money and cost effectiveness? So where we find that the lowest value transaction hasn't been purchased, if there are other considerations that need to be taken on board in terms of cost effectiveness or value for money, then that is also taken into consideration as well. So it's not just the best or cheapest option necessarily. There are other criteria that need to be included in the specification for that purchase and transaction that need to be considered as well. So that is taken on board. I'm sure Chris will elaborate on that later on. Questions 5 and 6 in terms of local, ethical and green where possible, and also the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I'm not aware of those considerations being included in the accounting instructions or contract procedures at the moment. In terms of our testing, we check against compliance rather than sort of strategic checks. So as advised in the answers there, Martin's due to attend the panel next time, I think, in the next meeting, and he's agreed to elaborate on that from a more strategic level in terms of the organisation and a corporate level, if that's okay. So I'll hold off on those. Obviously, I'll take any questions at the end, but Martin's agreed to elaborate on that later on. In terms of joint procurement activity 2.20, generally, where we are lead authority on any project or expenditure that goes through our general ledger, we would look to test that expenditure as a lead organisation, and we would expect a reciprocal approach from other organisations that are leading on transactional work. Anything that goes through our general ledger would be subject to our testing, essentially, and we would report on that if we are lead organisation. Any others that are leading, so for example, if it's a different local authority or different body, we would expect their audits to check those transactions and to give us assurance then as a general report. Question 8, I'm not aware of the procurement activities being audited externally. I have discussed with Chris as well, and we aren't aware, as far as I'm aware now, of it being externally reviewed. Also, we have our external auditors that undertake our external financial audit on an annual basis. But again, I think that's just verification really of the financial statements. I'm not sure in terms of how much detail they look at procurement activity. And I do think they tend to rely on the work that we undertake in terms of fundamental audits and also the wider opinion, in my annual opinion, on internal control for that. So I've been asked to provide some examples of internal audit of procurement. So 2.24 in section 9, I've given some examples really of recent audits that have been completed where we've undertaken procurement testing. Obviously the schools are a prime example, and I've attached that report, which I'll go on to later in more detail. But we look at different establishments. So we've got the Glyn Vivian, for example, district housing offices, different departments within the local authority, like the public protection team, youth offending service. So generally, as part of the rolling programme, nearly every single audit that we undertake does touch on testing of procurement activity and controls in place. The school's annual report for this year is in Appendix 2. I was asked to include a specific example of procurement. I think this is probably quite a good one, really, because it's a one-off, because obviously due to COVID, we haven't been able to visit a number of schools individually this year. So because procurement was seen as possibly one of the key risk areas for schools, we undertook thematic reviews this year for both comprehensives and primaries to check compliance with contract procedure rules and accounting instructions. Generally, there was, a fairly good outcome. We've always had some issues with compliance, obviously because of the delegated nature of the budgets with schools. But it's important to consider that in terms of the wider risk and materiality. When you consider the school's budget is probably 80 to 90% committed to salaries, the actual risk there of procurement activity is fairly low. They haven't got a lot of money to spend essentially on non-salarized transactions. So while we do pick up some non-compliance, it's important to sort of highlight that in terms of the wider risk and the materiality involved with the school population. Section 3 gives some overview of purchase cards. I wasn't asked specifically about this as part of the questions, but I thought it would be important to give members some idea of what we test on purchase cards, because obviously that's another way to transact and procure. Again, purchase cards are quite widely distributed across the organisation, and we have a similar card in schools in terms of the multi-pay cards. So the purchase cards we do test on a monthly basis. So we randomly select departments to test against compliance with the policy for purchase cards. We check transactions from the P-card system on the general ledger. And we also include that testing as part of our individual establishment audits as well. So any department that's got a P-card, we do test that, that method of purchase and method of transaction. The multi-pay cards for schools is slightly different because obviously they aren't allowed to have a credit balance. The payments for those cards are made by direct debit in totality on a monthly basis, and we check that those transactions are being checked by the bank reconciliations undertaken in the school, and they're checked then by the head teacher to check that there are two people involved and there is adequate segregation of duties there. So that's really the answer to the main questions. As I said, Appendix 1 gives a list of different contract or procurement type orders that we have on the overall orders universe, which is a list of all the orders we've got across the council. Again, these aren't necessarily done on an annual basis. They're done on a rotational basis based on risk. And then Appendix 2 is a fairly detailed annual report. Some of the audit committee members have seen this already, and we've been through this a number of times before. Some issues of non-compliance within the schools. But I'll draw your attention to the procurement part, because this report does touch on other parts, not just procurement. So page 16 of the report in section 3.10 gives some overview of the thematic reviews of procurement for the primary schools. Again, we did come across some non-compliance and some issues there, but nothing overly alarming or concerning. And then similarly with the comprehensive schools, on page 17 of the report in section 4.2, that gives members some summary of the outcomes. For the thematic reviews, the overall outcomes and the ways forward was communicated back to the schools via the school bulletin. So this could be a learning activity for all schools, essentially, to make sure they are complying with the relevant contract procedures and they are aware of the guidance that is available. I know there is work underway with the schools in terms of updating the school's procurement guide at the moment. Chris is working with Kelly in the education department to keep that up to date and make that more specific and relevant for the schools, which we're also involved with, making sure that schools have a very useful guide to guide them through procurement. But again, I'll just reinforce the fact that schools haven't got a lot of money to spend outside of salaries. So just to bear that in mind when we look at the context of this report as well. That's more or less it, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions or discuss any points that I've raised in the report, or if members have any specific queries on procurement generally across the council or our work.
Okay, has anybody got any questions? I have a few, but Mike.
Yeah, Chair, yeah, obviously I sit on audit, as Simon knows, and a bee in my bonnet really is around the recruitment in schools. And I've been asking for a while now, perhaps seeing as Chris here then, you know, when was in charge of procurement there with the local authority for us, in having perhaps advising perhaps schools, if it's possible, if they could even have a subcommittee in this area to sort of look at a way procurement is carried out, or even if it's an item agenda on the finance meeting, you know. But at least then there's sort of a safety net really in place. But if they did have a subcommittee, they could draw up put it into as a school policy and obviously put in terms of reference of how to comply with the procurement rules. I know this would, if this could be an opportunity, Chair, or perhaps, you know, an offer that could help to, you know, both our procurement section and our schools.
I think it's worth a consideration, but I think it's in another place we may have to ask schools their opinion on this, because there are quite a number of schools have got loads of subcommittees. So I think, you know, making it a subcommittee may be a good idea, but I think it's a question for the schools to be. We should ask the schools for their opinion, and then we can express our opinion in a letter if we send it out.
Yeah, as I say, you know, going back to, as I said, you know, being involved, but I know that that this is, as you know, when you look at the percentages, when you go in you know, look at a school audit report, it's usually in the mid-30s, where this is sort of flagged up as the main issue identified by audit, really. You know, and this is why I thought it might be an opportunity for both sort of sides to sort of work together to help the situation, you know.
Okay, we will ask the question anyway. Chris, you had your hand up.
Thank you. It was to respond to Councillor White and say, I'm thinking along exactly the same lines. And the Director of Education, Helen Morgan-Rees, is taking this up effectively on my behalf and saying to schools, exactly as Councillor Holly was saying, how would you like to proceed here? I think we recognise some methodology is best, but again, where do we fit it into the bigger system? The Director of Education, Helen, is saying, well, potentially, you know, a couple of representatives from schools could nominate a couple of representatives to work with us. So we've got that sort of regular interface. But I just wanted to mention that is something that I A, agree with, and B, are trying to, you know, we're working on that right now. Obviously with the, you know, the pandemic response and the ups and downs schools have gone through there. We're still working through that. It's a work in progress, but it's something we want to conclude shortly. And I said the Director of Education is agreed also to put something in place. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Anyone else? I have a couple of questions for you, Simon, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
I think on the school audits, I'm not sure if a system of using P cards for the schools would probably be more efficient and actually have a truer record for the schools and for the authority. and then you'd be checking them every month anyway, then through the electronic system of the P card. So that one. But I think more fundamentally, and I think this is one thing that as a procurement a scrutiny board, we've got to ask is, how do you work risk out? Because if you consider what happened with the Kingsway, the company went bust. We did have a bond, admittedly, but I think given the consideration that we've been through over the last, I know the last 18 months have been unique in the history of local government. I will admit that, but we have been in the past had contracts with companies that have gone into liquidation and gone bust or whatever. And I'm wondering, how do we work that risk out? Have we got an external risk provider for these type of contracts? And if so, that obviously comes as a policy. There's a cost to that. I know that some companies do have a risk assessment on any contract that they have, and that costs money as well. So I think that's something I would like, if you could explain it, or if you can't, if you can send to us the details of how we calculate risk. Do we use a third party to do that, give us risk assessment? And if we do, what is the cost of that third party? Peter, do you want Simon to answer the question first and then come back?
Sorry, Chair, mine is a different issue. I'd rather wait until...
Okay, Simon.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Chris. In terms of the P card for schools, the issue we've got there is because obviously the schools aren't on Oracle, they're on their own financial system, they've got their own SIM system. There is obviously an issue there. If we were to bring the schools onto SIMs, then it would be make it more streamlined, and it would generalize all on the same ledger. The issue would be in terms of interactions between P card on Oracle and then the SIM system. There is a similar setup existing in schools in terms of they've got a multi-pay card that is linked directly to their bank account. That's been set up for a number of years now, and the controls that we put in place for those, as I said, schools aren't allowed to get a debt or have any credit essentially. So their payments for those cards are paid directly by direct debit every month. So the full balance is paid out to the school budget, school bank account. For those transactions, we look at the individual statements for those transactions on a monthly basis, and we also check that those statements are reconciled to the bank account, and then also reviewed by the head teacher or the site or authorised signatory on site to make sure that there are two people involved, to make sure there's no single use of the card, and to make sure the head or the deputy is aware of the transactions that are being made. Part of the agreement for the school signing up to the multi-pay is also they're also required to make sure that they actually upload all that information onto SIMs. So they have to do a journal for every line of the transaction in that statement to get it onto the SIM system. So again, that would be tracked through SIMs as opposed to Oracle. I understand it would be easier for us to look at P cards as we are now in terms of a standard P card testing. But again, there's a complication there because of the delegation and the two different systems that are working not combined essentially. In terms of the wider risk, I think probably the biggest risk you were referring to in terms of contracts for construction and quite large value contracts. I'm not really in a position to answer that question, but I think maybe Chris might be able to elaborate. What we tend to find is if a school is going to enter into a large piece of work or a large contract or large construction work, they have to get education involved in the first instance anyway to make them aware that they're intending to do so. And there's also a landlord consent requirement as well, which is also then flagging up any large contracts or any issues that would go through procurement and education. So I'm not aware of schools being allowed to do that off their own back, essentially. They have to get the local authority on board and involved early on to highlight that they were intended to do that. In terms of assessing the risk of those contracts, I, as the Chief Auditor, wouldn't really be in a position to comment on that, but I think maybe Chris might be able to elaborate on how that's undertaken. Sorry to drop you in it, Chris, but I mean, I'm not really in a place to respond on that one. But that is the control. That is the control.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thanks, Sam. I would say that the procurement process is designed to highlight any risk. it would be looking at the legality of the situation, the commercial outcome that we're seeking, the social outcome, the finances of the company in question. And I think that goes to the heart of Councillor Holly's point. So we would undertake financial due diligence. There's a number of levels of due diligence, going down to any convictions the company might have for tax evasion, or, we have a whole list of things, and modern slavery in terms of the ethical supplier agenda. So we would be assessing companies against a range of strict criteria, one of which then dovetails into finance. The slight problem with any financial due diligence is it's looking in the past, of course, you're looking at the backwards at their accounts. But nevertheless, we do undertake that financial due diligence. We have a model which looks at, the net assets ratio of the company, the profitability of the company, its debt to assets. So there's a range of variables which are considered. So my team facilitate that, and where risk is identified in that process, that is then passed to our, in this context of finance, is passed particularly to our finance colleagues to look at, as you mentioned, things like bonds and other forms of mitigation as to how we would respond to that. So as the quick answer is, there's a process there, and I'm happy to share the documents to give you the detail behind that. And I suppose I would say, like any process, there's always going to be issues with it, but we're always looking to improve. But we do have what we consider to be a strong and robust process, and the procurement process itself drives that comparison of suppliers, and it is done on a regular basis. And the audit part of that, to go back to Simon's beginning point, we've worked very closely with audit to have this rolling program in place to make sure we don't just say we're doing stuff, we are actually doing it, and I think that's the contract procedure rules on the front, and then Simon's team coming in and testing against that and creating that visibility of the need to follow them, and the actual practice of doing so. So for example, other heads of service have said to me, nobody likes being audited, but we understand its value. It wakes everybody up to the fact these are serious things we've got to be doing, and it reinforces good behaviour. So yeah, that's okay.
Well, I understand that, Chris, but what I wanted to know is, on large contracts, do we go out to a third party to do a risk assessment?
We don't.
I'll give you an example on, let's say, on building a new school, and the company we pick to do it. Now, private contractors, when I was in, when I worked for a commercial organisation, we would actually ask for an audit, but we would ask a third party, and that third party, I can't remember what the charges were, but that third party would then say, yeah, it's categorized A1, A2, or whatever the figure was. I can't remember now, but we don't do anything like that. We just do our own internal audit.
Sorry, I mean, partly, I'm not saying it's to the extent that you just described it, but we do get a free batch of software from the Welsh Government called the Dun & Bradstreet system, which does exactly as you just said. It rates companies, and we will integrate that into the financial and assessment. Yeah, and if that independent software is showing any flags, we will certainly be using that information. But we don't, perhaps in the way you described, take companies through an externally sourced process. Something we can certainly look at, and I can see why you're flagging it.
Because then there is a framework, if you like, or a boilerplated framework from the Welsh Government that gives you a rating for the various companies that we employ, or locally and nationally as well, I would think.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Peter.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Mine is a rather different kind of sort of curiosity-driven approach in part. It concerns, in a sense, the concept of audit itself. And in this context, I'm thinking in particular of questions 5 and 6, which we're told will be dealt with at a later meeting of this panel, with input, of course, from Martin Nichols. And that's fine. I shall look forward to those with interest. But it's the concept of audit that perhaps could come under challenge, because here I am, I'm speaking as a lay person from considerable ignorance, no doubt, of the whole process of audit. But audit conventionally is about financial probity. It's about financial risk assessment. It's about financial value for money. In other words, it's very much focused on whether public money is being well applied in terms of the procurement process, in terms of what we as accounts do. But of course, questions 5 and 6 relating, for example, to ethical and greening procurement, 6 relating to the Wellbeing Future Generations Act. Really a question for Simon, and apologise to Simon for asking it perhaps. How would you, Simon, as an auditor, feel if these kinds of considerations were built into the audit process so that it became a requirement of audit that you would have to check that greening, for example, had been appropriately applied to a procurement decision, that the Wellbeing Act had been properly considered and thinking presumably about the future implications of a particular procurement decision? Do you see that fitting into the audit process, should that be a decision for the future? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I've got no issue with including those in our testing going forward. I'll be honest, those considerations haven't really been considered to date. As you're aware, like you've summarised early on, it's very much sort of financial based and value for money based testing. If these were to be considered to be part of our checks going forward in terms of ethical sourcing or greenly sourced, etc., and if that wasn't to be built into the accounting instructions, for example, or into the contract procedure rules, then we would quite happily consider those as part of our testing and review. I've got no issue in broadening the testing scope of our testing in terms of procurement. How we'd go about doing that, I think I'd need to take some guidance. I'm not going to be beating the bush. There are some challenges to determine whether procurement is aligned with the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. It's not the most straightforward of acts to follow. But I mean, I'm happy to build those in. If that is a recommendation that comes out of the panel, again, it's only a beneficial broadening of the scope of our testing. So it's not just purely financial based. And obviously these are strategies of the local authority and the Welsh Government generally. So if that was something that you'd ask us to build in as a consideration, that would be fine from my perspective. It would obviously broaden the scope of the review and the testing, which might take a little bit more consultation with the relevant parties. But yeah, I'm happy to take that on board, Peter, and build that in if that is a consideration that comes out of the review.
Yes, thank you, Simon. And I appreciate that it would involve a considerable expansion of the scope of audit as a concept in its application. And you're absolutely right, the how in terms of its process and delivery would have to be carefully thought out. Yeah. Well, thank you for your answer, and I shall look forward to the discussions of future meetings of this inquiry panel.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I mean, I did speak to Martin prior to preparing this report, so he's aware I've referenced him for those 2 questions, and I believe he's due to attend the next panel meeting, so he's agreed to elaborate on that more fully.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, I think, Peter, given that is the case, I think if we, as Chris has just said, about there's a framework from the Welsh Government which looks at every different company, maybe one of our recommendations should be the Welsh Government to add into that a rating for their ethical and environmental issues, and that way would take away, if I may say, take away some of the loading that would be put on our own departments, and actually have a uniform structure across the whole of Wales, which would make life easier for companies and for councils.
Yes, I would agree with that, Chris. Thank you.
Okay, is there anyone else that's got any questions, or Simon or Chris, is there anything else you'd like to add?
If I may, sorry, just
to
I'm working with the Welsh Government on not the situation you described exactly, but very much related to it, is how does the Welsh Government improve its direction to local authorities? So, for example, it could be in terms of environmental specifications and services. So I'm helping them review what they're calling a new centre of excellence, centre of knowledge, centre of, it could be good products and services that we can use and call off. So I absolutely agree with your point there of the Welsh Government taking a lead on this. And the other thing I would just mention, linking into Simon's earlier commentary, each of the services has a service plan that it defines how is it going to spend its money in the next 12 months. So, you'll know we've purchased electric vehicles. You'll know of the passive house outcomes. So these sort of green agenda outcomes, and that being integrated into what we would call the specifications of tenders. So I just wanted to mention there's a huge amount of good work going on already in the system to be aware of. It comes at a level, as I would say, of what I would say is the budget planning, the service planning. So by the time Simon is getting involved, it's checking has that, as we've said, that money been spent. But in order to say, well, are we complying? Are we doing the best we can? You're looking at how is the money allocated effectively, isn't it? What's it being spent on? And we have something called the service planning system. I just wanted to raise that with you. So each department with its budget, is going to be looking at how the money is going to be spent. And I mentioned again, electric vehicles, passive house, and I'm sure Councillor Hopkins can read off, plenty more examples of how that money is being spent in practice. So I just wanted to mention that for the panel's information.
Okay. David, do you want to say anything on what we've heard so far?
Yeah, I think we need to put it in some perspective there, because if we are talking about major projects within school, then we got many things that mitigate and monitor the risks. Myself, I actually sit on the development, the delivery board of particularly building new schools within Swansea, and I chair that, where we look at the risk we carry, particularly with the construction industry on a regular basis. We report back. But at the moment, very often the specification there with SUDs and everything else that we need to put it in, right, has got a very green angle or a green payback, particularly within the planning stages. So lots of things we do actually with schools, when we get to the planning stages, it puts in biodiversity payback, it puts lots of things into schools that we should be doing anyway. But I think the role of audit is to ensure that that's been spent accurately and as the specification for the particular role. So I think there is certain safeguards in place, but it all depends on the specification when we actually write up that. So, and I think within particularly, I use the city centre as an example. I think we demonstrate as a city council that we are very, very proud of our record with green in the city, and I think we got buy-in from the private sector as well there. So, but let me go back to the issue of schools and monitoring risk in schools. I think we need, I think Simon touched on it earlier on, 90% of everything we spend in schools are actually wages or salary related. And I think each one of us spend a considerable amount of time on governing bodies and financial committees within schools and monitor that risk as well. So schools, I think, have got their own built-in audit to ensure they get best value as well, because when I was chair of governors, the first thing I wanted to see was ensure that we had best value at every stage, particularly when we were buying anything. Each one of us have got a role. One thing I would suggest, and I know schools are inundated with different training sessions, but it possibly would help to have a training session just for the finance committees going forward on procurement and audit as well. I think lots of people don't realise the benefit of procurement, and I still see audit as a friendly, critical friend, and I think that needs to be demonstrated as well. So quite happy with what we've said today, but I think there's a lot more work can be done with schools.
Okay, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, David. I just wanted to sort of highlight really, I included the schools report purely just as an example. It's not a key concern of mine or a key risk from my perspective. I was just asked by Michelle to give something more detailed, really, to give an example of some of the work that we've done. And again, I'll touch back onto what David has said in terms of the amount of the school budget that they've actually got to spend on non-salary procurement activities is quite low. So, that needs to be borne in mind when you consider the overall risk involved here and materiality. Yes, we do see some non-compliance, but nothing that is unusual or untoward that we've seen before. Large contracts are few and far between with the schools, and in that case, they are run through procurement and through education. We've also got obviously the PSOs and the challenge advisors there to keep an overview of things as well. So there are things, as David has said, there are controls in place that mitigate the risks with the delegated type of spend or the delegated budgets. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight, the schools aren't a major concern of mine as it stands, but I just wanted to explain why that report was included.
I agree with you, Simon. I have to say that the amount of spend that schools have got isn't, well, might be unusual this year because of what's happened with the budgets, but normally it's quite a small amount anyway. I think when we get to look at social services in place, I think that's when we as a scrutiny board will see where the real benefit of audit within the procurement system, to look at what we get in out the social services, where for our, for domiciliary care and for residential care. I think those are the big issues, and I think with place, obviously it's how the contracts are placed, and we know now that the risk assessments are done by the council, and there is a framework from the Welsh Government to help them with that. So I think all in all, as you say, the schools are just an example, but I think there are other parts of the council where the risk is far greater, and I think it's those areas that the procurement system could help considerably, but we will wait and see what comes up from those departments, I think. And if there's no more questions, are there any more questions?
If I could just touch on that, Chris, before we finish. The
Yeah.
Appendix 1 of the report does give some further detail of dedicated procurement reviews that we've undertaken or we have on the plan. So you'll see there some of the key ones, which are quite large in value. We've got, the social services, social care contracts, cultural services, review of contracts. So these stand outside of the standard generic establishment reviews. So we have picked up on the materiality and the risks of those contracts there. So just wanted to highlight that in case, we skimmed over that a little bit in the report. We have got some dedicated reviews on the plan to cover off that risk. And that's
Yeah,
all.
because it is a big risk, there's no doubt about that, and one which obviously as a panel we'll be looking at in the near future. If there's no other questions for Simon or for Chris or David, are there none? That being the case, then can we move on to the work stream? And can I thank the three of you for attending? I think it has been quite interesting, and I know people don't like being audited. I know from what I can gather from what Chris just said, but I think I think it's if you think that's boring, you want to be in scrutiny and audit, so it's even a little bit more as well. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Can I leave the members hang on? The members of the committee boards hang on for a second, please. Thank you. We then move on to item 7 on the agenda, which is the inquiry panel, project panel. Okay. Right, Michelle, do you want to go through that?
Yeah, this is just what you agreed at the last meeting. I'm just popping it on there because it's now been agreed, and I'll pop it on each meeting so that if anything changes, you all know where we're at with it. But that's where we're at so far. Obviously, we've got all the meetings with the different departments booked in now, so that's till the end of September, and then we can start looking at the good practice and the other stuff, and any sort of consultation stuff. Then I should do that, over the coming months, so that will be booked in as well. Yep, so that's it really.
Has anybody got any members got any questions? No?
Obviously it's a moving document, so obviously if we doing extra stuff or you need to add things in and etc., we'll just amend it as we go along, really.
I think the one thing we will ask Chris to come back to us at some stage, and that is about our energy costs and how we've offset our energy costs with the solar panels on certain buildings. Now, I think that is something that as a panel, are we looking at procurement? I think that is something really important, because if the cost of our energy can be substantially reduced by increasing our investment in solar panels. I don't necessarily say wind turbines, because I'm not sure whether putting wind turbines on schools is a good plan, but I think putting the solar panels on will make a huge difference to our energy bills. And if battery storage is part of that as well. So I think one of the things, I'm not sure, I think it probably will be, we'll mention it in place, but I think it will probably have to go on to a further meeting, and possibly one in October, when we talk to others, local businesses and stakeholders. So it might be worth a while having an open-minded for that meeting where we discuss the implications of more green energy for the council and local authority and local people. Is everybody happy with that? Right, if that is the case, can I thank you all for attending? And I look forward to seeing you at Thursday's council, so I look forward to seeing you all on Thursday.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle,
Thank
do you want to stay on for a minute?
Yeah,
Thanks,
I've
Chris.
stopped
Bye-bye.
recording now.